let me ask you this. Do these guys, whether it's Gavir, Smotrich, Netanyahu, or the average person in maybe Jerusalem more than Tel Aviv, I mean, when they're seeing the things I'm seeing on my phone with, last week a child had his arm blown off and they're trying to tend to him without anesthesia on a dirty street. They're seeing the starvation that's happening. Does it just not register with these people? That's what I have a hard time with. Like I understand supporting your side. And I've said 100 times on this podcast, although I don't respect Netanyahu as a human being, as a politician, he's excellent. He's absolutely excellent. But the question is, him in particular, because he is so intelligent, he's seeing all this stuff. Does it just roll off his back? It's just so hard to look at this and not feel like, okay, you know what? This has got to stop. Let's figure this out. Like, I don't get the mindset.
You're not supposed to. You're not a racist.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You're not supposed to. It's like a sickness. You can't understand it. You're not supposed to be able to understand it. That's exactly the difference between racists and non-racists. Racists, their brain works differently. They look at a genocide and they're not moved. They love it. They want to do more of it. They want to see the Palestinian people die. Israelis, by and large, that's kind of, some are maybe a little bit more, like I said, polite than others and don't want to see it. But the reality is, this has been what Israel was about from the very beginning. And the education system in Israel is such that it not enable it, it cultivates this.
Cultivates it.
Racism. But when people look at it and they say, I don't understand, we're not supposed to understand racism. Racism is a disease. It's something terrible. And we can't understand it unless you're a violent racist person. There's no way to understand it. It's impossible to understand. You have to end it. World War II, the world knew Nazis have got to go.
Yeah.
You can't negotiate a ceasefire. You can't partner with them. They've got to go. It wasn't enough to send aid to the concentration camps, right? Which is what I think the parallel with what's happening in Gaza now. It's saying, we need to send humanitarian aid from God knows where. No, sure they need aid, but they don't need to be sent aid from America. Palestine is a very rich country with resources. Just open the gates of this concentration camp, this death camp, and let people access the resources, the hospitals, the water, the food. I mean, it's right there, a 5-minute drive out of Gaza, But this is something that these people look at and they think is fine. I mean, they created it and they want to see more of it. And that's the problem. And so we look at it and we go, how could you possibly allow this to happen? And it's so close. I mean, it's a small country. 2 million people living in that death camp now. 2 million people. It's not like a small, and nobody, and there's a point on the, because there's Gaza was created as a concentration camp. So there's like a fence around it. There's a border. And there's a point where there's a little hill and Israelis go to this hill. And I've been there and you can see the bombs falling and they stand there and they cheer. It's a disease that's just terrible. And that's why you have to get rid of it. You have to absolutely get rid of it. You have to dismantle it. You have to replace it with a real democratic, free Palestine on all of Palestine with equal rights. That's it. And then, of course, you have to supply the Palestinians with all the aid and so forth that they need, which is tremendous.
Yeah, I don't even know how they're surviving. You're not an advocate of the two-state solution, correct? And before you answer, again, I didn't know anything about this region, this conflict, this anything until October 7th happened. And then even then, I'll be very honest, when that day happened, I remember it was a Saturday and I started looking, I was like, oh, this is terrible. Whoa, God, this Hamas must be horrible. I didn't even really know anything about Hamas. And so you start to educate yourself as it went on. It has now become apparent to me, and I would love your take on this, I really feel like Netanyahu let October 7th happen. Whether he had a part in it or not, that's debatable. But I think the 6 hours it took for the IDF to respond, where every 5 feet, supposedly there's a checkpoint. I'm being a little facetious, but you get my point. I feel like he let that happen in order to enable everything that's happened since then. Because without a awful situation, it's kind of like 9/11. without those towers falling and that happening, that could not have enabled a 20-year forever war and invading Iraq and Afghanistan, Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think October 7th was, I don't know if I'd call it a false flag, but a staged event or an event that was let to happen in order to let what's happened since?
No, absolutely not. October, let me give you some historical context. October 7th, 2023 was exactly 50 years and 1 day after the October 1973 war, Middle East war.
Mm.
And I don't think it's a coincidence. Now, on October the 6th, 1973, the Israeli military, because of hubris, because of the fact that they thought the Arabs wouldn't dare, because that they looked down at the Arabs and their capabilities and so forth, the Egyptian and Syrian armies advanced, massive forces advanced and caught Israel by surprise. And by then, of course, the Israeli military was hailed as one of the great, and the Israeli military intelligence and the Mossad and everything. And with all that, it took days for them to start, calling up reservists and this and that and this and that and this and that. And there were warnings. There were intelligence warnings. Mm-hmm. But the hubris was such that they couldn't imagine the Arabs would dare. Now, here's an example of just how incompetent they are, okay? Today, the Suez Canal has bridges that connect it with the Sinai Peninsula. In those days, there were no bridges. The Egyptian military Corps of Engineers built bridges overnight. Israeli soldiers were in bunkers along the Suez Canal, and they were asleep while these bridges were being built, and then all these massive Egyptian forces surprised them.
Wow. Okay.
So 50 years and 1 day later, a bunch of fighters from one of the poorest, most oppressed, most surveilled areas in the world, place where, a glass of water was a luxury, clean water.
Yeah.
This is before October 7th. They came out and basically completely paralyzed the state of Israel. A paralysis which they still have not recovered from, by the way.
Yeah.
Completely paralyzed them. People did not know what was going on. The police, the military, the government, the press, citizens, nobody knew what was going on. It took them days to recover. And the reason was, and this was even revealed by a top military intelligence guy who had just retired, it did not fit their concept. The Palestinians in Gaza wouldn't dare. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't dare. They were expecting maybe an attack from Hezbollah in the north, from Lebanon, this and that. The Palestinians in Gaza, they wouldn't dare. They're nobody. Hamas is nothing. They would never dare. And they stood up and they did what nobody was ever able to do. No military has ever been able to do that, to completely paralyze and cast huge fear, horror in the minds of Israelis. They took over practically all of southern Israel. They took over 20 different cities and settlements in the south. I mean, they did something nobody ever thought, and it took a long time. And look, even today, the Israeli military is still fighting them, with all the destruction and so on. So I don't believe that this was as hard as it is to believe, because you're right. I mean, there's the surveillance and there's the military and there's this and there's that, but none of that helps when the hubris is such that you look down at the other side. And that's exactly what happened in 1973, in October 1973. And that's exactly what happened again in October of 2023. It's the hubris. It's the fact that they look down at Palestinians and Arabs in general. And they, like I said, the paralysis and the damage that was done to the state of Israel has not, I think it's irreparable. I don't think they will ever recover. And then the Yemeni forces closed the Straits of Bab el-Mandab, completely shutting down the port of Eilat, which is a very important port, and damaging and hurting the Israeli economy like no one was ever able to do. And the Yemenis have paid a heavy price. The Americans, the Israelis have been attacking them, bombing them.
Yeah.
And they're holding on. And I remember being interviewed.
They're holding on. It's crazy how these guys survive so much. Even Hamas and Hezbollah, it's like every time I look, I'm like, okay, they just wiped out the leadership. Oh, they just wiped out the leadership again. But they seem to hang on. That's the stuff that very, very candidly doesn't make sense to me unless America and Israel wants them to hang on, because you need a boogeyman. You need a big bad wolf. You need an enemy. I get it. I think maybe you don't think of it the way I do with that. And listen, I respect your opinion on that.
Look, I think that the reason organizations, groups like Hamas and Hezbollah hold on is because they are resistance organizations. They are there because of oppression. You can kill as many leaders of a resistance as you want for 100 years. It's not going to make a difference. It's not going to stop.
Yeah.
People want their freedom. People are looking in the Gaza Strip. People are looking out and seeing the wealth of Palestine, the wealth in which Israelis live, the wealth that exists everywhere, and they're living in a death camp. How are they not going to resist? So the reason they're holding on is because they have a legitimate cause that they're fighting for. What you're talking about is when suddenly they make China an enemy and they make Russia an enemy and they make this an enemy. That's the boogeyman. I agree with you on that.
Okay.
The case of Palestine, the reason it exists is because there's popular support for the resistance. And there's a good cause for the resistance. People say, yeah, Hamas is the problem. There would have been no Hamas had there not been the oppression, had there not been Palestinians living in these conditions, there'd be no resistance, right? So if you want to end the resistance, you have to end the oppression. If you want to end the oppression, you have to dismantle the apartheid. We've seen this a million times. Everybody's invested in the obstacle to peace. Everybody's invested in the obstacle to peace and stability and democracy. That's what the U.S. is paying $4 billion a year for, to maintain the obstacle to stability and peace. Maybe that's the boogeyman. I don't know.
Okay. And these surrounding countries, I mean, what are your thoughts on, does Egypt give a shit about the Palestinians? Does Jordan give a shit about the Palestinians? Does Qatar actually care? What do you think of these Arab countries? Even Saudi Arabia and UAE, where, their bread is buttered through the United States oil sales and then also the United States aid, where we're giving Egypt and Jordan, I know, over $1 billion on a yearly basis. Does that incent them not to stand up for the Palestinians, or where do you think that all plays out?
Well, you have to see the difference between the governments and the people. So these are not democratically elected governments. And so they act in order to maintain their power.
Right.
They're looking around, and what are they seeing? They're seeing countries that agreed to work with Israel and work with the United States, and they're fine. And then they look at other countries that didn't, and they see Iraq and Libya and Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan, and they're saying, well, as leaders, which way do we want our country to go? Do you want to end in rubbles like Libya or Iraq? Or do you want to maintain our government and maintain our state, maintain our government, and receive money and weapons from Israel? I mean, from the United States. That's the decision they have to make. So it means they have to throw the Palestinians under the bus. The population is a very different thing. Because these are not democratically elected leaders, the people's voice is not being heard, is not expressed in government. And so for the people, I mean, they support the Palestinian. Arabs have always supported Palestine, have always supported the Palestinian people. But their governments are different because the governments have they're completely detached from, and they don't need the support. They don't need the legitimacy of the people.
Right. Of the people. No, exactly. You're absolutely right. What are your thoughts on the different administrations and how they've acted, especially being in DC? Like, what did you think about the way the Biden administration was handling Gaza? And then what do you think about how the Trump administration is handling things right now?
There's no difference. They're all supporting the genocide 1,000%. It's completely complicit. American administrations have been completely complicit. It's horrible. And that's why so many Americans are so frustrated. Because of the complicity, because as an American, you're never a bystander, because it's our tax money and the people that we vote for,
right,
Washington, D.C., and then vote to send money to continue the genocide.
Want the full truth? Watch the full Deep Shallow Dive interview next. And hit subscribe if you're done with narratives and ready to call a spade a spade.